Hi, I'm Jim Cunningham. I have two special guests here today, Norma Hanneman and Stuart Wright. We're going to talk about why and how to use an LLC for real estate investing. So this is a very common topic that clients have. This is a warning. I'm a lawyer. I'm talking. This is not legal advice. Okay. So don't watch this and go out and do a bunch of stuff because you saw it on this video or this webinar. If you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're watching this live, we are recording this live. This is something where you can go to our YouTube channel and check out past YouTube programs or webinars, or we're going to go through this really fast. You may need to see this once or twice or three times. So we have offices in Northern and Southern California. We've got the San Francisco Bay Area photo there, Golden Gate Bridge and Southern California. We have 7 lawyers in our firm right now. We do focus exclusively on trust and trust and estate and tax matters and kind of family wealth matters, if you will. And that does include LLCs. I'm the CEO of Cunningham Legal, and I've been practicing over 25 years. We help clients in different states. So if you're located in a different state, we can help you in certain states. I'm a certified specialist in estate planning, trust, and probate law. I'm also a real estate broker and securities insurance licensed and a pilot. And we will have Norma Hanneman joining us here shortly. She's actually a good friend of mine. I've known her for many, many years. And she's a great best friends with my wife. And she was raised in Detroit, where my dad was raised. And she's was an interior designer and is an interior designer and a realtor. So she helps clients navigate the buying and the selling process of real estate. And she's going to focus more on the residential side. And then we have Stu Wright, a good friend of mine. Again, we happen to also live on the same street, which is kind of cool. Stu helps buyers on the commercial space, and we'll talk about the difference between residential and commercial. He is a United States Military Academy grad, which is West Point, and served in the U.S. Army, flying helicopters and protecting everyone here. So thank you, Stu. Second edition of the book is out. You can go to our website if you'd like to buy that. It's got an update with that sort of shifting sands, that changing landscape when it comes to IRAs and retirement plans. So it's very important to stay on top of this. And real estate, let's get into this, okay? We're going to talk about real estate. We're going to talk about LLCs. I would say LLCs can be very confusing for the non-lawyer, okay? This is just a fact. It's, what does that acronym mean? How does this all work? We're going to walk through that today. So real estate is a common asset for Americans. The United States, we really promote home ownership. That's a really big deal. It's part of being American. It's part of the American dream. And I think pretty much everyone agrees on that. Some people opt out of home ownership for whatever reason, but 65% of Americans own their home, right? And that's this year, 2022. And which also means that a lot of people don't, and there are a lot of people who are renting. But when we're looking at the residential side, home ownership is a real goal for most Americans. And understanding how real estate is owned, because there is a title associated with it, right? Understanding how that's owned can help you understand the level of control and asset protection. So a lot of people, they don't want to lose what they've created. They want to protect it, as well as what happens to the real estate when you pass away. So that's also really important, because when you leave this earth, you can't take it with you, okay? So 65% of people have a home, 34.6 don't. And that is 123 million households that are renters, okay? And that's 42 million households that are renters, right? So rents on average are about, now this is a national average. We're in California. I don't know what rents for $1,164 a month, but this is this means that the residential market alone is a $600 billion a year industry. It is the single largest industry in the United States, real estate. It accounts for 13% of gross domestic product, which is over $2 trillion. So let's get through a couple of terms. You're going to hear terms like real estate and real property and property. And what does all this mean? So when lawyers talk, we use the term real property. Realtors will use real estate, but lawyers, okay, being lawyers, we have different term for everything, right? Residential realtors sell real estate, and you will hear commercial property brokers talk about property. So this property traded for that price, that would be something a commercial realtor would say. And there are two big divisions in the real estate world. There is something called residential, which is 1 to 4 units. So that would be a single family residence. That's 1 unit. A duplex, or a single family residence with an ADU, which is an accessory dwelling unit. That is considered residential real estate. A fourplex is considered residential real estate. And the reason we focus on this is because the financing oftentimes is different. You know, if you have 5 units, it's different financing. If you have 4 units or less, it's FHA financing, and we'll talk about that. Commercial property includes multifamily of 5 or more. So if you're thinking about investing, okay, well, do I do a 6 unit? Well, that's going to be a different process than a 4 unit. Okay. Commercial property also includes office, retail, and industrial property. I will tell you right now, industrial is super hot because we've just, you know, hopefully we're coming out of COVID and the use of the properties changes. And then you'll hear other terms like landmen and timbermen. I put that in air quotes because they could be a woman doing it, right? But those are some other terms you might hear. So if you're dealing in timber property or land, there's also oil men who deal in oil leases. So those are some other type of terms you might hear. Something to understand, real property always has a title, okay? Your watch probably doesn't have a title. Your furniture doesn't have a title. Your car has a title. Your house has a title. Your bank account has a title. So it's really important to pay attention to title because title matters, especially in real estate. It can decide who gets the property when you pass away. It can decide who can take that property away from you if you have creditors. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna walk you through some different methods of holding title before we get to the LLC, because you need to understand, these are foundational, you need to understand that. So methods of holding title to property. Well, you can hold it in a limited liability company. I want to start with that because that's probably why you're watching this. Like, okay, real estate limited liability company. Tell me how this works. The LLC is on title. So when you buy a property and an LLC buys a property, your name is not on title. The LLC is on title. It's on the deed. So instead of you owning the property individually, the LLC is owning that property. Now, this can provide creditor protection, and I would put an asterisk there. It is not blanket creditor protection, but that's something that depends on the nature of the LLC and depends on the nature of the creditor, but we can certainly talk about that if you have questions. And a benefit is anonymity, quite frankly. If you do it right, you have anonymity. Unfortunately, in California, if you create a California LLC, you are required to disclose to the public who the manager of that LLC is. So you may not appear on the chain of title, but you're going to appear in California's LLC system through Sacramento. Now, there is a way around that. That's a very common way of getting around that to maintain anonymity. I would say the difference when you compare, should I buy a property with an LLC or should I just have it in my own name or some other vehicle? I would say that there is Karen feeding with an LLC, and there are state fees and tax filings. So with the limited liability, the LLC owns the property. And instead of you owning the property, the LLC owns it. The benefits of an LLC is a great legal tool. I think it blends the best of partnerships and corporations into this new thing called an LLC. It is extremely flexible. You do not have the corporate formalities that you do with a corporation. You also have creditor protection and anonymity. And again, the downsides are the Karen feeding and the compliance. So let's talk about ways to own property. So I will tell you, I spent 6 months on this in law school. I'm going to give this to you in far less time. Okay. This is not a whole 6-month course. I'm going to cover this in a few minutes, maybe 6 minutes. I think you need to understand this before we really fully understand the LLC, because the other thing to think about, somebody has to own the LLC shares. You know, for many of our clients, it might be in another LLC. It might be in a trust. It might be in another vehicle. So it's very important to understand different ways of owning property. Sole owner, I think this is one of the most common ways to own real property. The sole owner has full control over the real estate. I'm going to talk about bankruptcy, not because you're going to go bankrupt, hopefully not, right? Or hopefully no one here is going to go bankrupt. But we do talk about creditor protection within the context of bankruptcy. But the problem is you have to be insolvent to have your petition granted. So I would say California is very creditor friendly. Bankruptcy protections are weaker when compared to other states in California. So we have less bankruptcy protection, and LLCs can create insulation from creditors and lawsuits that keep you from going bankrupt in the first place, right? At death, if you own the property solely, that property passes under will, passes under intestate succession. If it's in your living trust, we would count that as a sole owner, and that would pass, of course, outside of probate. So Hal takes title to Greenacre as Hal, a single man. It's sole ownership, pretty straightforward. tenants in common. So when two people own property together, one way they can own that is tenants in common. So if two people want to go into a partnership and buy a rental, which is not uncommon, many times the title ends up being tenancy in common. Now, something to understand about tenants in common does not have to be equal. It can be 25, 25, 50. It can be 99, 1, 99%, 1%. Each co-owner is free to transfer their respective portion of the tenancy in common. So absent a tenancy in common agreement, right? So a co-tenancy agreement, meaning, if you have three owners, they can come together and agree, look, no one's going to sell without, the approval of the other. That would be an agreement that would be done. And that's beyond, or that's outside of the scope of just the holding the title. I would say with more co-owners, there is a higher possibility of creditor claims. Could you borrow against your 25%? Yeah. In the real world, it happens in very limited circumstances. I don't see that a whole lot outside of basically San Francisco. So you do have tenancy in common agreements where you can borrow, but the interest rate is typically higher. So the other thing too is one co-tenant can force a sale. One co-tenant's creditors can force a sale of the building. So tenancy in common, has some benefits, has some drawbacks. And again, at the owner's death, whatever that portion is at 25% or 50% is subject to probate or the living trust. And so Hal and Fred take title to Greenacre as tenants in common. There are three ways to take title. One is Hal and Fred. If all it says is Hal and Fred, by the way, Hal in our example is the husband or will be the husband, and Fred is the friend. So you can see where that's going. So Hal and Fred own a property. If all it says is Hal and Fred, period, that's tenancy in common. The law implies that to be a 50-50 split. Hal and Fred as tenants in common. Now we're expressing this tenancy in common, and these are the rules in California. And again, the default is 50-50, but it could also be Hal as to an undivided 75% interest and Fred as to an undivided 25% interest. That term undivided means Hal has a right to 75% of the whole. Fred has a right to 25% of the whole. So if the property were rented for $100, Hal would get $75. Fred would get $25. And both of these interests are subject to probate at death unless they're in a living trust or some other type of vehicle. Okay, joint tenancy. I think joint tenancy and tenancy in common, very misunderstood. When you go to buy a piece of real property, hopefully your realtor will say, I don't give you any advice, but you tell me how you want to hold title. Okay, so as you can see, title is very important. The big difference between joint tenancy and tenants in common is the last man or the last woman standing gets the property. Okay, so, and if it's two people, it's 50-50. If it's three people, it's thirds. It must be equal. You can't be joint tenants 75%, 25. It's got to be 50-50 or a third, or 25% each. So it's the number of people divided equally. That's joint tenancy. As people die, everyone else sort of inherits, and their piece of the pie gets proportionately bigger. So there's a problem with this, though, is you can transfer your joint tenancy interest and sever it and have it become tenants in common. So it's freely transferable, and that would defeat the rights of the other person to succeed, right? In the case you passed away. So joint tenancy, I would say, we do see it in our practice for a variety of other reasons. I would say it's probably suboptimal, but there sometimes is a case to be made for owning property as joint tenants. And again, it's a higher probability of creditor claims, and a creditor can force a sale. So there's a book here. There's a saying, if mama ain't happy, ain't no one happy. Hal and Fred take title to Greenacre as joint tenants, and Hal dies. Well, Hal's married to Wanda. Fred gets the property, but Wanda says, Fred, what are you doing? You took our money and you bought this property with Fred. So Wanda's not going to be happy. And, you could see a lawsuit with that. You could see a very unhappy surviving spouse. So that's something to be mindful of. If you're married and one spouse owns property as a joint tenant with another, that can be problematic. So community property is if you're in, and again, I'm talking about California, and community property are basically all the states that used to be part of Mexico, that the U.S. acquired after the Mexican-American War, and Florida and Wisconsin. And I think it's optional in Tennessee and Alaska. So community property, only spouses can own community property. A single person cannot own community property. When one spouse dies, that property stops being community property. It's something else. This applies to all types of all types of property, not just real estate. The community is considered one unit. And I distinctly remember sitting in my law school class 30 years ago and learning about community property. And my professor said, the community. So when I say the community, it is two spouses, right? So two spouses who are married, or in California, if we're talking California property tax, it also includes registered domestic partner. So that's interchangeable with spouse. And here's the weird thing. Only one spouse can be on title, but it's still community property. So if I earn money and my wages and I put those into my bank account, that's still community property. Just because my name's on there and I'm the sole owner of that by title, it is still community property and my spouse still has rights to that. So one spouse can transfer or mortgage his or her respective portion of the community property without the other's consent. In the real world, though, you're going to have to sign a quitclaim deed. So what I mean by that is if you're buying property or if you're selling property and the title is in one spouse's name, most title companies will require a quitclaim deed, which says I release all right, title, and interest. They're typically going to require that. So that's one reason you might see those. And then community property with right of survivorship. This is kind of new, I don't know, in the last 15 years or so. Basically, it says community property with right of survivorship. So when one spouse dies, the other spouse takes that property without having to go through probate, because if you do have property, if it's Hal and Wanda as community property and Hal dies, Wanda's going to have to go to court to get full title to the property, right? So the community property with right of survivorship does solve that. Of course, this could be in your living trust as well. So with the community property with right of survivorship, of course, you do not have to go to court to clear that. Now, it really doesn't matter. And I'll put an asterisk here. If Hal and Wanda hold title to Greenacre as community property with rights of survivorship, Hal could have a will that says, I leave everything to my kids. She is going to take that property by the title and by virtue of having survived Hal. So his will not cover those things that pass by beneficiary designation. Now, I'm going to mention tenancy by the entirety. This does not exist in California, but if you live in California or another state and you buy property in another state. So I was just talking to a client today. They say, we want to buy a home in North Carolina. I don't know if North Carolina has tenancy by the entirety. They might, and it's a slightly different animal. So it's a form of real estate ownership between spouses. It applies not only to the primary residence, it applies to rentals. So if you're thinking about an out-of-state purchase, pay attention to this. One spouse cannot transfer or mortgage a real estate without the consent of the other spouse. So that's really important. So unlike community property where each can do whatever they want with their respective half, tenancy by the entirety, you got to both be on board. Extra creditor protection, creditors of one spouse can't go against the real estate. So again, don't go to the bank on that, but you do have enhanced creditor protection. At death, the surviving spouse automatically becomes the sole owner without probate court involvement. Again, this does not exist in other states, but it does if you're a California resident and you buy real estate in another state where they have this, that may be an option. Here's the takeaway on that. Get legal advice. This is not a do-it-yourself project. It's too important. Buying real estate is a major investment. You really need adequate advice. Is it expensive? I don't know, it might be, it might not be. You just need to get some competent legal counsel. So the other alternative is to have the property in a living trust. So in a revocable trust, you're controlling the ship, right? As long as it's your trust and you're in charge, you're handling everything. It's for you. In an irrevocable trust, you're going to have some restrictions on that. People do use irrevocable trusts for different reasons. Other than what we call foundational estate planning. They might use a living trust to save tax, or an irrevocable trust to save taxes. And at the owner's death, the real estate does not go through probate, but it's transferred and according to the terms of the living trust. So Hal and Wanda can buy Greenacre and put it in the H&W Living Trust. Hal dies, Wanda's in charge. And when Wanda passes away, the property goes to Andy, Betty, and Charlie, their 3 children. By the way, something to note, we have a lot of content on our YouTube page on this. Hal and Wanda can protect the inheritances of Andy, Betty, and Charlie far more than they could protect their own property if it's done properly. And that's the Inheritance Protection Trust. And we detail that in my book. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. So watch out for refinancing. This is a gotcha. Sometimes when refinancing happens, the title of the property can be changed, especially if you have a co-signer. And a lot of times this happens in the 11th hour. They're like, well, you don't qualify. We're closing in 3 days. You need to get someone else on title. You really need to pay attention to this, folks, because you're going to be signing a stack. In California, it's a stack of paper like that thick. And you're going to go through that really quickly. And sometimes the most important documents are the shortest, right? The deed, it might be 1 page. That's kind of an important document. You need to pay attention to it. So I would say check with your lawyer. If you're a client of ours or a future client, you can certainly check with us. And now, here's something we hope you'll really like. I used to watch Rocky and Bullwinkle as a kid. I couldn't resist. Let's talk about owning property in a limited liability company. Instead of dealing with all the sole ownership, tenancy in common, whatever it is, you have a company that owns the property. Sounds kind of simpler, doesn't it? And you, who would have otherwise bought the property as a sole owner, let's say, you have this limited liability company buy the property, and then you own the shares of the limited liability company. Okay, so that's conceptually what's going on. And the LLCs do not have to have an operating agreement. Corporations must have bylaws. I would say that any LLC that leaves our office does have an operating agreement because we're just dealing with more important stuff, frankly. I mean, real estate, you should have an operating agreement. You will need, if you own property in California, inside of an LLC, you will absolutely need an operating agreement. Otherwise, you will probably get reassessed on that property when you put it into the limited liability company. Most of our clients do not get reassessed if they don't want it. Some want to get reassessed. We've got a lot of other content out there. What I talk about reassessment is your property taxes potentially going up, but then being protected by Prop 13. So an LLC, if properly constructed, does not cause a reassessment. Okay, let me be clear. So the LLC provides limited liability. The creditors can only go after the assets of the LLC, right? So if you buy Greenacre and it burns down 3 or 4 other houses next to it, the liability is limited to the assets of the Greenacre LLC. They can't come after your personal assets, right? So it isolates it puts that liability in a box and protects your other assets. And that really, frankly, is the chief benefit when it comes to creditor protection of an LLC is just limiting your liability. And if it's structured properly, your personal creditors cannot go after the assets in the LLC, which is a topic for another day. But if you're interested in asset protection, I would suggest you reach out to us. Helen want to create H&W LLC. Helen want to put money into the LLC. They get shares in exchange for the money they put into the LLC. And then the LLC goes out and buys Greenacre. Now, why would you want to buy a property with an LLC? It's because the LLC becomes the original owner. And if you've seen any of our Prop 19 or Prop 13 videos, you know how important that is. Because Hal and Wanda, when they buy this property, the property goes up in value, but the taxes don't go up as much as the property goes up. And when Hal and Wanda die, it is possible that Andy, Betty, and Charlie can keep their low Prop 13 taxes and not be reassessed. And so let's fast forward. We're in 2022. Let's go fast forward to 2050. Greenacre, they pay $1 million for it. Now Greenacre is worth almost $6 million. The assessed value is only $1.7 million because your taxes can only go up 2% a year. And the property taxes are $17,000 in 2050, not $57,000. Okay. So this is a real benefit of owning property with an LLC. The kids inherit that property with those low property taxes. So, or those lower property taxes. Of course, by 2050, a Starbucks Grande Latte will be $21. So there you go. Basic LLC rules, very briefly, every state allows for some form of an LLC, including the District of Columbia. They do not have to have an operating agreement. A corporation must have bylaws. LLCs are super flexible. They lack the corporate formalities of an S or a C Corp. There are several options that you can have in an LLC. It can be taxed as a disregarded entity, which means that there is no federal income tax return. You would have to file a state income tax return if required. In California, you do. I would say this is the simplest tax structure. And this is commonly used for real estate or taxed as a partnership. So in California, a couple can own, let me back up, spouses, not registered domestic partners, spouses, people who are married, can own an LLC and it be a disregarded entity if it's community property, which it probably would be. In other states, that's not the case. You might have to have it taxed as a partnership. So a partnership does require a separate income tax return. This goes to the care and feeding of an LLC. So this partnership does require a Form 1065. Something that's very important is you can get an adjusted cost basis at death. So if you've depreciated this property down, when you pass away, you get a new basis at death, but you have to make your 754 election in your 1065. I know it's a lot of numbers to throw at you, but we have one client. CPA literally did not check the right box. It cost our clients $2 million. So, but we didn't do that. That happened before they were clients. So there's a lot of gotchas in here, folks. This is not a do-it-yourself. I would say that partnership structures are common for real estate. LLCs can be taxed as an S corporation. You have to file an 1120S. They can be taxed as a C corporation. These typically, we do see some C corporations, and Stu, maybe you can talk to that when I bring you on. But this is more legacy. This is for people who, yeah, grandpa put this farm into the C Corp in the 1950s. But modernly, if you're going to set this up, I would say you're not going to be using a corporate structure. The key takeaway here is if you're going to own real estate with an LLC, you'll likely end up with an LLC taxed as a disregarded entity or a partnership, and you will likely not choose to be taxed as a C Corp or an S Corp. I think you can make some extreme cases, but I'm trying to give you a high level so that you have familiarity with these terms, because these are really, really important terms, right? This is stuff that you need to know. It's different than doing it yourself, but being familiar with it, it helps. You got to get a social security number, which is an employer identification number. You might hear the term TIN, which is taxpayer identification number. An EIN is used for a business. So it's that 9-digit number that is, it goes 2 digits dash and 7 digits instead of 3 digits dash 2 digits dash 4 digits on a social security number, but it's still 9 numbers. These are not interchangeable, but you do need an EIN. Now, let's talk about investing in a real estate. Let's say Helen wanted to say, you know what? It is time to invest in real estate. It's a great inflation hedge. Helen wanted to say, we've got some money saved up. We saw Jim's video. We're ready to create our LLC. We're ready to go out in the world and buy a property, okay? You have 2 choices. You can buy residential, which is 1 to 4 units, and then there's everything else. I mean, those are the 2 hemispheres. And so I think those are fundamentally different types of properties, and we'll see why. But I will say, if you're going to look from 1 to 4 units, you typically go with a residential property real estate professional. Okay, so that's where you go to the residential people. And then if you're going to do something of 5 units or more, you typically go through a commercial or industrial real estate professional. So these are 2 separate groups of it's almost like litigation attorneys and transactional attorneys, right? Those are 2 separate practice areas. So Norma, if you can join us here, Norma and Stu. And let me do this while you guys are queuing up here. Let me answer just a couple of questions here. Gerald asked, I have several limited partnerships, but now our shopping centers are held by multiple limited partnerships, which harms our asset protection format. We need to assign each shopping center to 1 LLC for asset protection. Once you have LPs and LLCs, there is a problem of maintenance to preserve the entity so as to not pierce the corporate veil. How to keep proper records. Should there be 2 properties held by 1 LLC, or should every LLC be a single purpose? Gerald, great question. That needs work, because LPs, frankly, I didn't even mention them as a way to hold title to property, because an LLC is way better. Okay. So an LP is an old way of holding real estate. I would say, Gerald, go ahead and schedule a time. That prep meeting should probably be with me. You can go ahead and reach out to us and schedule a time. But something to understand that, Gerald, you raise a good point. If you have all your properties in one entity, one property can take the whole entity down, right? So I would say most people, Stu, I don't know, chime in. Do most people who own multiple commercial properties, do they have separate 1 LLC for each property or not?
They do. Generally speaking, they have 1 per property.
Yeah. Anonymous asks, hello, I'm interested to learn where you recommend that an LLC used to hold title to real estate should be domiciled. My partner and I are California residents and will not move, and will hold title to non-residential commercial properties in multiple other states. Typically, we hold each separate title in an LLC domiciled in the state where the property is located. What are the advantages and disadvantages to domiciling LLCs in various states? Anonymous, great question. If you are a manager of that out-of-state LLC, if you personally are that manager, you must register in California, okay? So what most of our clients do, they have a holding company. We love Wyoming. We choose Wyoming Close LLC. The Wyoming LLC is the manager, and that tends to solve the problem. But if you have multiple LLCs, you're going to be subject to that $800 a year minimum franchise tax by virtue of being the manager. So a workaround is maybe you can appoint somebody else's manager in another state and be the agent of that manager. But that's something certainly that if, again, reach out to us. I think I can walk you through that and I can help you untangle that. So Stephanie asks, if you own a duplex where one unit is a second home and one unit is a rental unit, should it be put into an LLC? Ooh, that's a really good question. An LLC is not for personal use assets. If you rented that from the LLC, that's an option, but that's a tough one. Could you put a personal use asset into an LLC? Perhaps. Stephanie, I think that's going to be fact specific. I'd probably want to talk to you on that. And Gerald asks, why spend so much time on how you hold title? Could we get to LLCs? All right, there you did. Russell says, if title's taken as husband 48%, wife is 48%, and son, I'm assuming, is 2% as joint tenants, since they don't own equal amounts, is the title presumed to be tenants in common? Russell, I believe if you say 48%, and 2% as joint tenants, it's tenants in common. That just is a problem. Anita says, what if two friends purchase a property, 50-50 tenants in common, and they had a written agreement that both had to agree on any potential sale, and now one wants to sell his 50% and the other doesn't? What prevails, the vesting or the agreement? Anita, I believe the agreement is binding on the two individuals. The agreement likely does not run with the land. And I know you're a realtor. I think that agreement probably prevails. Again, it's information only. What's a cost range to set up a California LLC with your firm? It depends. We can certainly talk about that, but setting up the LLC is not a big deal. It's the operating agreement and all the other stuff that goes with that, but we could certainly talk about that one-on-one. I would say realistically, the range, you're probably, I don't know, it's hard to say. That it's all over the map. Anonymous asks, I heard the LLC can easily be pierced in California. Yes. Is it really worth it if it's not going to be broken? How do you protect it better? So what we do with many of our clients is each property will be owned by an LLC, and then those shares of the LLC are owned by a holding company. That holding company has asset protection. Your LLC, right, that owns that one property in California, if there's a problem with that property, that LLC is liable, okay, to the extent of the assets in the LLC. That's just the way it is. Mark says, me and three siblings established an LLC with one apartment complex in 2017. We have not generated any meeting or notes since then. Is this a concern if we are to get sued? Yes. Will the other side be able to pierce the corporate veil because we have no records notes other than state filings, such as a statement of information and paying yearly $800? Mark, I think you're probably taking excessive risk on that. And you should, with three people, you should have an operating agreement, because what if one of you dies? What happens, right? You should have an operating agreement. Anita says, when an LP purchases property, should you buy as an LLC? And can you put multiple properties in the same LLC? Yes, you can put multiple properties in the same LLC. Here's the problem with a limited partnership. A limited partnership must have one general partner. You can have a limited partnership. So if you're looking at LLC versus limited partnership, the problem is you end up with a corporation typically as the general partner, and then a limited partnership. So you have two entities you have to deal with. An LLC, taxed as a partnership, gives you the limited liability without the need for a general partner, but it gives you the limited liability with less hassle, less headspace. Is it better to have a multi-million-dollar umbrella insurance versus an LLC? We have a rental property worth $2 to $3 million in value. Anonymous, it's both. You want to have insurance is cheap. I would be adequately insured, but remember, insurance has three limitations. Number one, it's limited by time. It's only valid for claims during that period. Secondly, it's limited by coverage, right? Something may happen and the insurance company says, well, that's not covered. And then the last one is, even if it is covered, you do have a maximum that you can claim against that policy. So I would say it's a yes and. Why is Wyoming LLC so good? Mike, it's a Wyoming Close LLC. Wyoming Close LLC gives you a really good protection, and we view that in our firm that the laws in Wyoming are the best in the nation. Single owns 5 real estate properties, save Prop 13 taxes on 2 properties. What's the benefit, and can I do an LLC? Yes, Janet, you can, and you're a client. You should just call us, and we can help you out with that. Adamant asks, what about series LLCs to own several properties? I did some in Nevada and thought they were permitted in California. They are permitted. Cellular LLC, the downside in California, you have to pay $800 a year for each cell in the LLC. I think Nevada's a $10 minimum franchise tax. So that's, by the way, if you're getting your head wrapped around your axle on the $800 a year minimum franchise tax, don't worry about it. If you actually have income, that kind of melts away when you do a tax analysis, if you have any kind of income on that property. Okay, so Norma, I've talked all this whole time.
Keep talking. You're doing great.
Hey, it's good to see you.
You too.
And tell me, when people invest in, let's just say, like, take our example of Hal and Wanda out there. They say, you know, I'm worried about, I'm worried about inflation. I'm like, how do I, with inflation, it's gone crazy, right? What are some good hedges against inflation? Everything I read says, look at real estate, right? No, I'm not saying buy it, but look at it. How do people take title? Like if it's a husband and wife, what are you typically seeing? How do people take title on that property?
I mean, if they're husband and wife, they typically take community property title.
Yeah.
But as a realtor, I can tell them things, but I am not a lawyer and I don't like to advise them on something that some advice they should get from a lawyer. Yeah.
So what do you hear when people are looking to invest in real estate? And what we're talking about here is residential 1 to 4 units. There's rent control, that's kind of new in California, although it exists in other states and other, municipality or other cities. And what about FHA violation? Is that a big thing in the real estate industry? Federal Fair Housing Act violation, I should say.
Well, it's a tricky thing. As an example, right now we're in a situation where there are multiple offers on homes and people write letters in order to be more favorably looked at from the seller. And those are typically, in some states, they're becoming illegal because I am a family and I have children, or I come from this area, I have this occupation. All of those things can be viewed as, how do I say, what's the word?
It's a violation, right? Because you can't say, oh, I'm not going to sell to you based on a protected class, right? And so, or rent to you. Okay, so something to understand about financing on 1 to 4 units. FHA limits, these are the maximum. Now, in many California counties, you're going to see the maximum. A 1-unit property is up to $970,000, meaning you can come in with a very small down payment, and it's $1.8 million for a 4-unit. So that's something to think about. Now, these are typically owner occupied. So if you're thinking, wow, it might be nice to buy a 4-plex or a duplex, live in one side and rent out the other, there's some really favorable financing arrangements. You can get non-FHA financing, but that is typically, well, sometimes it's more expensive, sometimes it's not, it depends. They could be higher or lower depending on your down payment. And one kind of hack here, Norma, I don't know if you see this much, but let's say you're deep into escrow, you're 30 days into escrow and you're getting ready to close, you're 40 days into escrow, and you go, wow, you got some deferred maintenance here. We did our inspection. Do you see people try and beat people up on price toward the end of a deal?
Usually, always, but not in this market. I mean, in this market, should I talk about this market or in general? No,
I mean, I think, we're in May of 2022 and the market I'm reading might be starting to soften or slow down in certain areas. And I think that's on sellers' minds. But I mean, just talking general or the market, however you want to do it.
In general, as a realtor, I say there are 3 ways to negotiate. First of all, when you put an offer on a house, you're negotiating price. There's the possibility of negotiating when an inspection is done and there are problems with the house. You can still negotiate. And the third one, of course, is appraisal value. If it doesn't appraise, you can negotiate. The one thing to keep in mind in those cases is if you really want the house, if you, as a buyer, ask for a reduction in price based on one of those issues, the seller can walk away. Your contract is binding until you start changing the rules. And once you do that, if it's a buyer's market, you have clout. If it's a seller's market, they could walk away because there are 5 or 10 other people looking for that house.
Yeah.
And-
That's always kind of, one wise, old, very wealthy client. And that's one of the benefits of doing estate planning for 25 years. I've gotten so much wisdom by osmosis, right? He said, property always trades at its market value. You're never going to get a deal. Now you can argue with that, but he says it's what you do with the property, right? And so a lot of people flip. Is flipping still viable? I don't know. Is it?
It's very hard to come by because you can't get a good property at a very low price, or you can't often get property at a low price. Is flipping going on? Absolutely. But it has to be a condition where you are not paying extra for the house, because then you have to put more money into it. Right now, people are overpaying for houses.
So I think some pros about investing in real estate, a lot of our clients are W-2 earners. They might make a lot of money. They have, basically, if you're a W-2 earner in the United States, you're really getting raked over the coals on taxes. You are just paying and paying and paying. If you're a business owner, you have a lot more flexibility. But I think one of the great things about investing in real estate is you do get something called depreciation. And this is passive. It's passive activity. So you buy a piece of property and the government basically says, over a 27.5-year period, this structure is going to fall down. So we will give you an income tax deduction based on 1/27.5 of the value of the structure, right? And so that is really important. Also, the interest paid is tax deductible. So the interest that you're paying on that home is deductible, and that's going to offset the taxability of the rents. You can also use a self-directed IRA. There's a lot of schools of thought on that you should or shouldn't. And I would say that real estate fundamentally is less volatile than the stock market. And one problem with the stock market is these stocks are priced every second, right? And you go, oh, the stock market's down, the stock market's up. Real estate is a little bit more.
And traditionally, over time, you make more money on real estate.
Well, that's leverage. Yeah. You raise a great point is, if you come in with 25% down on a rental property, you're borrowing the 75% and your tenant's paying the whole thing. Yeah. And the property goes up 10% in value. You've just made 40% on your money. Yeah, that's the power of leverage.
Your money instead of your own.
What about tenants being a pain in the neck?
Well, that could definitely be the case. But the key is to vet your tenants. Not that negates any issues. There are always going to be issues, but vet your tenants.
Just
because they're friends doesn't mean they're going to pay their rent on time.
Right, but you have to be careful with that because you cannot say no to people who are in certain protected classes. So it's this balancing act. So
people say protected class, but there are certain things that you can do, as in their credit rating. That is not a protected class.
For now in California, but there is a murmuring of taking away the credit check for tenants. So if you're considering buying rental property in California, you need to be aware of all of the rules that come with it. Now, most people, I don't think, use property managers. I see it with my clients, about 20%. A lot of them, the mom and pops, they're just doing it themselves. I've got one client with a gajillion number of rentals, single family residents, and they do it themselves. They don't use property management. So now let's move to commercial real estate, Stu. So we're leaving the world of the single family home, duplex, triplex, and fourplex. And now we're moving downtown to the big high rise.
All right.
Now we're moving into commercial real estate, which is everything 5 units and up and everything that's not residential. Why do your clients invest in commercial real estate? Because I know you represent a lot of wealthy families, a lot of bigger companies that handle real estate. Tell me why people invest in commercial real estate. Make the case.
Well, there's a lot of tax benefits, as you're aware of, to owning real estate. Some of those that you mentioned, writing off the interest paid on a loan or depreciation. There's those benefits. There's the tax deferred 1031. There's a lot of benefits that way. And right now also, it's a good hedge against inflation. So that's why a lot of people are jumping in right now as well, feeling like it's a great vehicle and to invest rather than watch the stock market on a daily basis and stress out.
Yeah, a lot of my clients are stressed right now. So as we record this, the market's going in a downward direction, and it's volatile. Volatility's up. I would say on a high level, the people that you're dealing with, the tenants you're dealing with are different. Okay. So in a single family or multifamily, these are residential. This is where people live. And what we're talking about is where people may warehouse goods. Amazon may have a facility that I don't know if they ever own those, right? I think they just lease them. Somebody's got to own that warehouse. And we're talking about offices. So there are some benefits. You're not going to get that call on Super Bowl Sunday with the leaky faucet or the backed up toilet. You're just not going to get that on Super Bowl Sunday because everyone's at home, right? They're not in the office. Hopefully they're not in the office.
Right. Yeah.
And then you've also got, the issue of tenants maintaining property. Sometimes they actually have an obligation to maintain that property. Maybe talk a little bit about a triple net lease and what that means.
Right. One of the main properties that a lot of our private investors like to purchase are triple net properties. So that would be like a Starbucks, single tenant Starbucks, or you could get a multi-tenant building with, nail salon, Starbucks, and something else. But what those do is you purchase it, all the expenses are passed through to the tenants. So there's really no work. And oftentimes even property management is written into the agreement, into the leases, that can be passed through as well. So you could even have a property manager doing any small little details or expenses that are incurred that have to be paid, that are going to be paid back through the tenants. But it's a very, very passive way to invest commercial real estate.
And that is probably really common. I mean, those Amazon facilities are triple net leases typically, aren't they? I mean, Amazon's paying for everything, right?
Right. A lot of your industrial buildings are triple net leases, not always. A lot of your retail is triple net. And depending on what market you're in, a lot of times office buildings are, but not in our Sacramento office or Sacramento market.
Okay.
It's typically full service.
Yeah. And that really gets into the difference between residential and commercial. Typically on residential, someone will pay you a check. Now, true, they have to pay their own utilities, their own trash. Some people want to pay the water bill because they don't want their plants to die, which is always kind of a little bit dicey. But what I see in many commercial transactions, well, the triple nets, the tenant, like you say, the tenant's responsible for everything. Is there rent control for commercial property?
No, not.
So what are some of the downsides? I put on here time commitment, mo tenants, mo work, right? So if you have a strip, if you have a strip mall with 19 tenants, it's going to be a headache.
Well, it can be, but if you have a property manager and you have a good property manager, they're handling all of this, day-to-day things, and you're having to make calls and get on calls occasionally if you need to release a space.
And then typically if I'm going to buy a commercial property and fix it up, I don't want to say flip it, but if I see that there's a commercial property that has deferred maintenance and I'm going to redo the parking lot and I'm going to redo the storefronts and maybe it's got some vacancies, but I really have the opportunity to increase the value of the property. How long does it take typically to get those spaces leased out? And I know it's hard to generalize about that, but with real estate, you fix something up and you put a for lease space and you're going to rent it in that day. Right. Does that happen in commercial real estate?
No. And that brings up a great point. An investment broker like myself can advise you, but they should pull on a leasing agent as well onto the team if you're going to go with a value add property, and just give an idea of the time to lease that up. How long is my downtime? What is the expenses that you're going to incur? What are my commissions going to be to get that leased up? What are the tenant improvements for the market? So all of that, I would recommend if you're going to go into that value add segment of the market, that you kind of have a team assembled, but there can be a point person like myself, right?
So you bring up a good point. It's almost like in real estate, in residential, you've got the real estate professionals who are buying and selling, but then you have management companies who are managing. But it's almost like this added thing, which the leasing people are different than the property managers, are different than the people like you who might advise somebody on the value of a building and whether to sell or buy this or that. So it's like an extra subspecialty. So this is really helpful. And then you're seeing about 80% of commercial property is owned by LLCs typically, if not more.
Yeah, I would say at least 80%.
Yeah. So let's talk about investment. You know, when I look at real estate residential, you can come in with 25% down for non-owner occupied in many instances. What are you seeing in terms of, if I'm going to buy a $5 million piece of property under a Starbucks, how much down payment do I have to have?
Well, generally speaking, for like a triple net deal, you have to assume that you're probably going to have to put about 40% down. So you're going to get 60% loan to value.
Okay.
You might get a little bit better than that, but I think that's how you have to kind of approach it. You might only have to put 35% down. And the less risk, perceived risk by the lender, of course, you know, they're going to get more aggressive with the percentage of the loan.
And then you've got, this is kind of a big deal. You know, with residential, you have different types of liability. With commercial, you can really have outsized liability because many of these places are open to the public and they've got people, not all, you know, a warehouse many times isn't. But if these are office or retail, you're going to have people coming in and out of there and stuff happens. You know, fires start, people get, you know, whatever can happen.
Trip. Yeah, they trip or whatever.
And really, if people had to ask me, is it more important if I could only have an LLC on a residential or on a commercial, I, as a lawyer, would say take the LLC on the commercial property, because I think there's more inherent risk. And it's a fire risk, and we're coming onto fire season. There's already some fires going on now. That is the big risk. We've had 2 clients with ranches where fires started and they almost got wiped out. So we're getting close to the end here. Drop and swap. So Hal and Paul own HP LLC. P is his partner. That's why his name's Paul, which in turn owns Red Acre. So Hal and Paul, they've been partners for a long time. They want to split the sheets. That's a legal term for saying they want to dissolve the partnership and effectuate a tax-deferred 1031 exchange. So if you don't know what that is, or if you want to learn more about that, please look at our YouTube page. We have lots of content on 1031s. And they want to defer the taxes. Now, if Hal and Paul take the property out of the LLC and drop it to themselves individually, and then pretty much right away sell the property, California is not going to let you do a 1031 exchange. They're going to zing you on that. And you're going to be responsible for the 13.1% capital gains tax. So very, very important. They would be better off doing a 1031 inside of the LLC and then waiting a period of time. So that's one that got you. This is a bit of a warning. If you're watching this, don't just think you can pull the property out and sell it. You absolutely need to meet with advisors and make sure you don't step in it. So when should you use an LLC? I would say it's recommended for up 1 to 4 units. You got some creditor limitations with the LLC, but you got to weigh the care and feeding. Also, if this is a legacy property that you're going to have for your kids, you might be able to preserve that Prop 13 tax rate in perpetuity if it's done right. I would say it's essential for commercial properties. I would say you're making, you know, how do I say this and be nice? But if you own a commercial property in your own name, I think you're taking excessive risk. I think it's a bad idea. And what about 2008? Stu and Norma and we were all working during 2008. And I will tell you, the smart people I talk to, they say that's a once in a lifetime event. Well, the Great Depression was a once in a lifetime event, and my grandparents talked about it for the rest of their lives. I think we're going to talk about 2008 for the rest of our lives. Yeah. You may want to have the recourse on the loan be limited to the LLC. And on that question, Stu, are you seeing personal guarantees with 40% down on a commercial property?
Yeah, it depends on the deal size, of course. You know, if you're doing bank deals, most of those deals are recourse loans.
Recourse meaning if the property goes south, you're personally obligated to pay that debt. So something to be mindful of. Again, real estate is a great inflation hedge. I mean, I kind of feel like we might be back in like 1972 or 1973 in terms of the appreciation for real estate. So get your A team. These two, Stu and Norma, Norma, I don't know which one you are. I think Stu's the guy on the left. Get your A team together. It's a CPA financial advisor. They form the three-legged stool. And in this case, we would add a fourth leg to the stool, which is the real estate professional. And biddy, folks, that's all. This is we have some questions. This is our YouTube page. Please check it out. We have a great amount of content on there, and we just kind of take these dives and I give you my insight on what to do and what not to do. And if you'd like to schedule a time to speak with me, you can go ahead and schedule a time there. And Stu and Norma, their information was up there, and I think we have it again, but go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube page, review us on Google, and we will cover some questions here. Let's see, we have some remaining questions. Mike asks, if the property is owned by an LLC, does it get a step up in death? If it's taxed as a partnership, yes. Disregarded entity is a little trickier, but the short answer is yes. That's the way it works out. So I'll leave it at that. Should a duplex purchased as a sole owner be converted to an LLC if the property is now in the name of the trust? You know, Anita, I would look at an LLC for a duplex. Again, it probably would be a recommendation of ours because I'm really concerned about liability. You just never know what's going to happen. Anonymous asks, is what you are calling Wyoming Close LLC the same as a Wyoming Holding LLC? Is there an actual distinction or something your firm is calling it? What we're talking about here is a holding company. So a company that does not have an operational business, but all this company does is holds shares of other LLCs. That's a holding company. And so that holding company is written as a Wyoming Close LLC in most instances. Gerald asks, when you plan to discuss LLCs and the technicalities thereof, please let me know. The seminar is not labeled correctly. Okay, thanks, Gerald. Yes, many new tenant regulations, rental increases, and percent notice timeframes, rent controls coming into communities, a need for due diligence as a landlord. Yeah, and Norma, that's something that's new, of course, right? This statewide rent control, you can't raise it more than 10% ever. You can always raise it 5%. And if inflation's somewhere in between, you can raise it to that. Triple nets aren't on triple nets. Daniel asks, on triple nets, aren't terms of leases usually long with limited annual increases? A problem with this level of inflation. Yeah, you want to talk about that, Stu, on a triple net lease. So what are you seeing as a typical term?
I would say for credit tenant, and when I'm talking like a credit tenant like Starbucks or drive-through, you're probably only getting rent bumps every 5 years. But you're more local or regional tenants, you're probably getting 3% annually.
Okay, so that might not be keeping up with inflation. And that sort of begs the question,
correct?
Have commercial rents kept up with inflation? I don't know. Have they? Haven't they? I mean, probably depends.
Yeah, I think they have, generally speaking, the standard is kind of 3% annual increases. Mm-hmm. The thing is, and this is getting kind of into the weeds a little bit, but as you have those rent increases and you're ready to sell, you get to capitalize that income, that rent growth over time, and that actually helps your property appreciate in value. So
okay, so that's very important to note. Things that you can do in your leases increase the value when you want to go to sell the property. And what I see a lot of clients do, a lot of higher net worth clients, they're selling properties every 7 years or so, because one thing we didn't mention is cost segregation. It's where you can accelerate the depreciation on your building. So they sell that building, they buy another building, they take on more debt, they have more basis. So when you look at your return on a commercial property, I would not look at it merely as like, well, I'm getting this return. You also have to factor in the tax benefit, which is tangible. I'm a partner with other family members in an LLC with a rental property. Can I put my 25% of this LLC in my living trust? Yes, if the operating agreement permits it, most do. Will my beneficiaries inherit my 25%, or will the other partners get the option to purchase my 25%? Anonymous, that all is contained in the operating agreement. Okay, so that's why it's important to have an operating agreement. Anonymous asks, is real estate in an LLC held in a revocable living trust just as if it were joint tenancy? So the LLC owns the property. The shares of the LLC can be owned by the trust. Any comments or advice for taking title to inherited real estate in an LLC? Would that be classified as original owner? Typically, if original owners are people who, when they acquire the property is reassessed. That's an original owner. If you acquired that in a parent to child transaction and the property was not reassessed, then you are not the original owner. Diana asks, if you are in joint tenancy with your son and you pass away and he inherits your share, does that happen without probate? Yeah, joint tenancy. Well, this is interesting. Texas requires you to say joint tenants with right of survivorship. California doesn't require that. But based upon those facts, I would say, yes, the property goes to the surviving joint tenant. But that assumes people die in order and on time. Kelly asks, how do I get around the personal guarantee for financing? I'd like to keep the full protection of the LLC. Stu?
Yeah, there are ways that you can negotiate with your lender, whoever it is, to negotiate that out of the loan. Some banks may not be open to that though. And, it just depends on the deal, but you can negotiate that out of the loan. It may cost you too.
Yeah, a little bit higher, a little bit bigger down.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Anonymous says, thanks for the webinar. Do you have any videos relating to tax deferred sales trust? Would appreciate learning more about deferred sales trust in comparison to 1031. Deferred sales trust is that's under intense scrutiny by the IRS right now. The DST has two acronyms. Delaware Statutory Trust is one, which is does not have the intense scrutiny. Deferred sales trusts are currently, and I've been talking to one of the lawyers defending about 15 of these deals. These are really under the microscope with the IRS. I think that's certainly, Kim, if you can take a note of that, we can talk about that. Man asks, can a Wyoming LLC managing an LLC set up for commercial real estate in a third state and the LLC operating shareholders live in California? Will there be a need to set up an LLC in all three states? Yeah, man, I would say many times you have a holding company outside of California, and each property, no matter where it's located, has an LLC in that state. Anita says, so if one transfers sole owner property to an LLC, is the property reassessed? As long as the proportional interest remains the same, no reassessment. But once more than 50% of those LLC shares change hands, the whole property is reassessed. And that brings us to the end. Norma, Stu, thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you for joining us here for another webinar or YouTube if you're watching it. So thanks.